Okay, so as I promised at the beginning of the lecture, and let me make sure I promised that. Yep, I did. I said I would basically kind of give you, I might have mentioned that I'm going to kind of give you 3 ways that sociologists kind of think about how we use values, but I'm really just going to give you 2. So these 2 are really kind of embodied by our readings, and they're actually quite similar. But there's just kind of some different nuances between these 2 readings, but I think these 2 readings are pretty good examples by a working social scientist, pretty popular social scientist, about how we could use values to think about culture. And you'll, the astute student out there, you will realize that there's a little irony here, which is that both of these readings kind of use values to talk about really broad categories like whole societies or whole nations. And so it's in some ways kind of reach back to that old anthropological idea of wanting to talk about kind of broad differences. But they do it in careful ways, which is they use lots of measures about values to try and hone into some specific things. And they're not saying that they're trying to describe all of a society or completely nail down what exactly runs a society. And they're definitely not even talking about what makes for individual action within a society. They're really kind of painting with broad brushes, trying to give us some general ways to talk about differences in quote-unquote culture, or differences in culture, and they're using values as a way to talk about those differences. So let me take you through a little bit of these readings just to make sure you understand them. And of course, you'll need to do some thinking on your own in order to answer our discussion question for this week. So this first approach is by this guy named Roy D. Andrade. And he's got this little tiny book, and I only gave you, I think, 8 pages out of it. Tiny book, as you can see right here. It's called A Study of Personal and Cultural Values. I gave you just like, what, 8 pages, 6 pages out of this chapter called The Americans. Now, the chapter starts off really clunky, but by the time you kind of flip to the next page, you're really into it. And I want to make sure you focus on figures 7.1, Table 7.2, Figure 7.2, and then finally Table 7.3. So what's going on here? Well, D'Andrade took these long list of like 328 questions and gave them to college students in America, United States, Japan, and Vietnam. And what he's doing in this short chapter here is he is doing some comparisons between countries and is trying to basically kind of understand the cultures of these different countries by comparing some of these answers to these 328 questions about values. So let's look at a couple of the interesting outcomes here. Well, actually, let me tell you a couple cool things about his approach. One, you find that in order to talk about culture in these broad ways using values, you gotta ask a lot of questions, because if you don't ask a lot of questions, you're making assumptions about what values are. And that it can be hard, and he's also showing us that values aren't kind of this silver bullet way to talk about culture, because what he finds is a lot of agreement between these different societies, and that's a real important one. And then he finds that you can get to the exact same outcome in a society through different values. In particular, in this little part of the reading, and this is clear in Table 7.1, he shows that you can get to support for capitalism in 3 different societies, United States, Japan, and Vietnam, with very different value orientations. And that's really important, because that's exactly the opposite of what Weber argued. Remember, Weber had this kind of tight argument about the Protestant work ethic connected to this kind of idea goal, and that's what gave rise to capitalism. Well, D'Andrade shows us in that one table, just that one table, that, hey, you can have very different values line up with support for capitalism in these three different societies. And that in and of itself tells us that there's no kind of lock-in perfect prediction between a value orientation and a particular social outcome. That there's a lot of gray area in this, but it's still cool. What he's doing here is, I think, is still pretty cool. So let me point you toward a couple things. Page 62, figure 7.1. Make sure you look at it. In the reading I gave you, you'll see here really quick. This is a scatter plot. Just in case you don't know a lot about social science methods, a scatter plot is basically a correlation between different items, different question items from a survey. So for example, in this case, he could take a question such as, how much do you like bananas? And he would ask that of the American college students, and he'd ask that, in this case, of the Japanese college students. And he might find that, wow, American college students, they like bananas this much. Japanese college students kind of like bananas about this much, which means actually that they're pretty well correlated. In other words, Americans like bananas about as much as Japanese people like bananas. Now, I have no idea whether that's right or not, so don't quote me on that. That's just my example. What he does find, and this is really interesting, that overall, you'll notice that this scatter plot basically you could run a line through it. We call that, a sociologist call that a regression line. In other words, you could do a line with a pretty consistent slope right through here that shows us that on almost all of these different questions, and every one of these dots is a different question that D'Andrade asked in his survey. On almost all of these questions, Americans and Japanese agree, are the same on all these different value orientations. What he says, though, is that you have to look really closely to find where they don't agree. And you can do that by looking at the most top liked items by either country. So Americans, the values they say that they like the most are not the same ones that the Japanese say that they like the most, which are over here. So he says you have to ask a lot of questions. You have to look really closely to see differences between great big national societies like this. But when you do, voila, you get table 7.2, which is, he writes right there, out of the 328 value items, he lists for Americans, what are the top 10 most strongly, fervently supported? For the Japanese, what are the top 10? And for the Vietnamese, what are the top 10? And when you do that, you get some kind of interesting things. You can see that, yeah, societies do differ in some ways. We could use values, measurements of values, to help us understand those differences between societies. And then you get also, make sure you pay attention to page 66, this table 7.3. That's where I mentioned that he created a scale about capitalism, competition, and economic growth. He had some questions about those. He put those together and said, okay, what are the other questions on the survey within each country that most correlate or most connect with capitalism? And he finds these kind of crazy results here, which in one country, certain values connect with capitalism, but in another country, other values connect with capitalism. And so therefore, he tells us that, hey, values aren't this silver bullet that have a watertight connection to one outcome like capitalism. Instead, there can be quite a bit of diversity across cultures. And then finally, he has this great observation in the last page of that reading where he shows us that, ironically, when you actually talk to people within one country about values, Americans at least have a tendency to think that they themselves embody values a lot more and a lot better than other people in the United States. And he is kind of funny in that part of the chapter and saying, that's one problem in talking about values is respondents, i.e. us, when we answer a question, will often think we do these values, we embody and symbolize these values of being an American much better than all those other people who aren't me. Now let me just close really quick by saying the other example from our reading is one of the most famous, one of the most international, and one of the most long-running social surveys of all time, called the World Values Survey. Guess what? It is given A, throughout the world, and B, it's about values. Imagine that. I'm going to give you a link on D2L where you can actually go to the World Value Survey, you can play around with the data, you can look at different countries, you can find some cool results. But one of the most famous results of this 3-decade-long social science survey is this map, and this is what your reading was about. There's actually 2 maps in that reading. One map, which is the one I have here, is survey results from 2005 to 2008, and another map further down in the reading is survey results from earlier surveys. What these people who do the World Values Survey end up arguing, and you can catch this all in that short reading, is they say, we think you can compare societies, nations, through 2 dimensions. And they get here by asking, again, lots of questions, and then they compare the answers to questions between countries. And what they find is that you can actually make comparisons between countries, and you can explain most of the variation between countries on values by thinking about values in 2 dimensions. Dimension 1 in this map, the x-axis, is what they call survival to self-expression values. In other words, how much do people in a given society have to focus on survival versus self-expression? Or if you really want to think about this one way, how much do they have to focus on getting something to eat that day versus posting on Facebook? Okay, that's the tongue-in-cheek way to think about that. And the categories in this map on the x-axis are how they align on that dimension. On the y-axis is what they call traditional to secular rational values. Now, I would argue with this a little bit, but they argue what that means is how much in a given country are kind of traditional religious values the main driver of values within country. The countries at the top, not so much. The country at the bottom, quite a lot more. And so with these 2 dimensions, they plot different countries, and then they make this funky old map where they kind of draw these broad historical traditions that characterize these different countries. Now, one of the reasons why they did this project is they wanted to see, is it the case that countries that have industrialized or modernized more end up with different values? They say the answer is yes, and you can see that by looking at the more industrialized countries. They say that those countries tend to shed traditional values a little bit more, and they tend to not have to spend so much time on survival, the people in those countries. And so therefore you kind of get developed countries over in this kind of upper right quadrant of this map. They also look at some other things that they say if you do this enough over time, like they have been doing, and you produce maps like they have been doing, and we have 2 maps in our reading, you can actually see that things change. So that as countries kind of grow wealthier or develop, or as things happen within countries relative to each other, they'll move around this field. And that's kind of cool. Now, if you look closely at this map, you can, and just use kind of your own common sense, you can also ask yourself a question. So they plotted countries, but then they drew the funky colors that I mentioned. And these funky colors are them saying, well, you can kind of see grouping. But I ask you as an interesting question, could you group these countries in different ways? Or do these groupings work? Do some of these lines seem arbitrary? Do they seem to make distinctions in some parts of the map that don't seem like distinctions that mean very much? So I'll leave it at there, and let me just summarize by saying it seems that some of the best ways to use values in sociology are to talk about broad differences between societies, but that overall there are a huge amount of shared values between societies, and that if you put values into conversation with other things sociologists measure, then you can get to a lot deeper understanding. So I'll leave it there for now. You've got a discussion question this week, and always, if you have questions, make sure to email me sooner than later. Okay, have a good week.